So let me introduce Tim Aubry. He's a professor in the School of Psychology and co-director of the Center for Research on Educational and Community Services at the University of Ottawa. He is currently holder of the Faculty of Social Sciences Research Chair in Community Mental Health and Homelessness. He was a member of the National Research Team and the co-lead researcher of the Moncton site in the at-home chez soi, demonstration project of the Mental Health Commission of Canada. Tim teaches graduate courses at the University of Ottawa in community psychology and program evaluation. So, Tim.
That's great. Thanks, Rachel. That's good. No, I'm in a good mood today. You probably don't want somebody from Ottawa showing up and gloating. Be the worst thing, eh? Coming to Calgary, holy man. But there's some nervous Hab fans among us. Anyhow, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Because I followed what's going on in Calgary. In fact, I applaud you every chance I get, when even in media interviews and so on, because I really think you're out ahead of the rest of the country in terms of how you're addressing homelessness. And I guess I was thinking a little bit of what should I talk about today, to a group that's ahead of the curve and so on. And I thought what I would do, because the last 5 years, or it's probably going on 6 years now, I've been involved with this at-home chez soi project. We have another Housing First project in Ottawa that we're doing. I've been immersed in it. And I'm coming off a sabbatical, and I was doing writing, and did a book chapter on summarizing housing, supportive housing, the outcomes of supportive housing. So I thought, well, maybe I could just reflect a bit on what would I see as key findings coming out of the Housing First research that's going on and that I've been involved in, and then get your reactions and see what you think, and see if we can have a discussion about that. I'm actually trained as a psychologist, so you wonder, what's a psychologist doing working on homelessness? Because psychologists like to get inside people. That's. But I did specialize in community psychology, and the focus of my research has really been on deinstitutionalization and the development of community mental health services, community supports. In the mid-90s, I got approached by the Alliance to End Homelessness in Ottawa to become involved in their work. They were just starting out. It's a coalition in Ottawa, and that really got me into the issue of homelessness. And it's been very interesting, at times frustrating, but I do think we're making progress. And I'm going to start with a cartoon, because I was inspired yesterday listening to Steve's rant about about the publishing enterprise, and I thought, I got to pull up this cartoon. So I put it in last night. So it's not an easy world, eh? When you're trying to publish stuff, but you got to take your bumps. Okay, so you're all familiar, I think, with the at-home chez soi project. I'll give you a very, very quick review. It was a trial, multi-city trial, 5 cities. We used mixed methods, so quantitative, qualitative. It's followed people for 2 years, and it was people who were absolutely homeless, or they had recent episodes of homelessness, and they were housed in SROs and rooming houses and so on. We tried to open up the black box, did 2 implementation evaluations, 2 fidelity assessments. I'll talk about that. And each city, except for Moncton, had 3 arms. So there was an arm for people who had the highest level of need, another arm for people who had called moderate level of need, and then there was a kind of a locally created arm, which gave the communities a chance. It had to be housing first, but it made for some pretty interesting adaptations that I'll talk a little bit about. The other project I've been involved in is what I call the poor man's trial. Because you go from at home chez soi, I don't think I'll ever be involved in a project quite as big or as ambitious. Even though the Americans do a lot of those kind of projects, but we don't have a tradition of doing those kind of trials, and I think they can, and I think make a huge difference. Anyhow, this other project is kind of piggybacking on the at home chez soi. It started a little bit after. There was an agency, Sandy Hill Community Health Center in Ottawa, has a program called Oasis. Works with people with severe addictions. They decided, with the help of CMHA Ottawa, to put together a Housing First program. Now, it's a group of people who, a lot of them had been banned from the shelters, very, very heavy users, lots of involvement in the sex trade, and they were going to really look at trying to bring housing first to the population. And there's been a debate in the literature even whether people with severe addictions can settle and leave homelessness through Housing First program. So I thought it was an opportunity. We've got about 85 people. It's quasi-experimental. So we kind of recruited everybody coming into the program initially, and then we went to their waiting list. And we used the same tools as at home chez soi, and we did one fidelity assessment and one implementation evaluation. And I think it's the kind of thing, I should mention, because I do think one of the legacies of at home chez soi is it can help with evaluation. There's a set of tools there, kind of that you can go to and access and use. And there was an attempt to really use the best possible tools that were out there, although there's still some deficiencies. So let me go. So this is my top 10, the 10 findings. I don't know if any of you are David Letterman fans, but might be dating myself. Used to stay up late in the 80s watching David Letterman. And he's going off the air. So the first one, got to talk about housing outcomes. So the housing outcomes in at home, and I think you know this, they're unequivocal. If you look here, what you have is the red is the housing first, the blue is treatment as usual, which was any other services in the community, housing and support. The red is all of the programs together that are housing first, okay? So you can see across the 5 cities, we have a gap, significant gap. And this is a measure of housing stability. So it's kind of what percentage of people were stably housed in 3-month segments over the 2-year trial, okay? Now, you can see in Moncton, now Moncton had the biggest gap, and to some extent, really the best housing outcomes. I happen to have been involved there. That's not really the reason, though. It had the highest vacancy rate, and it really, and I'll talk a little bit later about the landlords, but they really stepped up to get involved and partner with the program. In Moncton, we had, so small city, probably the size of Medicine Hat, about 100,000 or 120,000 if you go Greater Moncton, and also the rural adjoining region, which is the Acadian population in southeast New Brunswick. Montreal, what they put in place as their third arm was housing first with supported employment integrated into it. Okay, so a program that tries to find work for people once they have housing. In Toronto, the third arm there worked with a multicultural agency and tried to adapt housing first to really kind of culturally sensitive services, you know, given the multicultural makeup of Toronto. Winnipeg, and you can see Winnipeg had the toughest time in terms of the gap being the smallest, okay? Now, there's a few reasons. Vacancy rate less than 1%, okay? 70% of people in the study in Winnipeg self-identified as Aboriginal. And it was a tougher effort to get people into housing. They worked with the Aboriginal agencies, the community agencies in Winnipeg, and again, the third arm was adapting housing first so that it was in line with Aboriginal culture. And then out in Vancouver, it was quite interesting. They work with people. There's a kind of a higher proportion of people with concurrent disorders, so mental health problems and substance use problems. Their third arm was the only congregate program. Okay, so they took over, renovated a motel in Vancouver, and had about 100 people in there, and the support was on site. So all of that to say that, you know, I think what the project demonstrates is across Canada, you can adapt housing first in all sorts of ways, whether it's in big cities, small cities, and as well target the different needs and makeup of the population. Now, this is our project in Ottawa. We essentially found the housing outcomes. This is the first year, because we're just at the point now of doing the final interviews of the comparison group. But you can see the percentage of time people spent housed in the first year. So that's it'd be the far left column. You can see the housing first. It's in around 80% of the time. The service as usual or treatment as usual, again, any services in the community, was less than half that, okay? So again, you know, another population, people with severe addictions. We're finding so far that people have settled into housing. So number 3. So big database. There's over 2,000 people in the at-home chez soi. So one of the issues which gets discussed in the research literature, on the ground, in programs, is who should we deliver or offer housing first to? How do we differentiate people who are going to be successful versus those people it's probably not a good fit? So we looked at that, and so far what we've done is we've taken the first year of data it's about 1,150 people who received housing first, and we were interested in seeing what would predict success in terms of housing outcomes in that first year. So who ends up settling and staying in their housing, okay? Now, we found that in the first year, about 86% in at-home chez soi settled, you know, had some success in housing. And there was 14% that ran into trouble, multiple evictions, or they never engaged with the service providers. They just didn't get into housing. And what we found was the prediction models, and I know there's economists here, you like regressions, multiple regressions. The prediction models were very poor, okay? In fact, we did logistic regression, so we were trying to predict, very simple, who's successful, who isn't. We start out with 86% who are going to be successful. With the prediction model, we can maybe predict, I think it was about 88%. It added maybe 3% more, okay? So that suggests that it's pretty tough to predict who's it going to work out with, who's going to have success in housing first. In terms of variables, and I would call them almost vulnerabilities or risk factors, the ones that showed up were length of time, lifetime length of time homeless, amount of time in jail prior to entering the study. Interestingly, psychological integration, people who reported being more integrated in their community had some vulnerabilities, okay? So, that idea of trying to get away from a street-based network might be at play there. But bottom line, we're not explaining very much of the variance at all. And we put everything into these equations, everything but the kitchen sink. So it does raise issues around trying to prioritize, in terms of who should get housing first and who's going to have trouble with it. Okay? And I think it suggests that at this point, okay, our tools to be able to predict this kind of thing are really at a very early stage of development. And if you're in the game of trying to prioritize, I think you don't want to suspend your clinical judgment, your knowledge, and so on, and rely too heavily on measures, on quantitative measures. Now, this is a slide I got from Sam Simbaris. What does it all mean? So you start out, 80%, 85% of people get housing first, and they settle in housing. Now, it's probably not as high as that, quite frankly. I think it's probably maybe more in line with 3/4. I mean, we are going to follow people for 4 years in this study and so on. And I think you've got some data, too, that we saw yesterday that's very interesting. But it does raise the question, okay, so if everybody gets housing first and it doesn't work out for some of them, what do you do? How do you help those people? One suggestion in terms of the way the system should operate is you start on the top step and you get, permanent housing. You get the portable support, scatter site. If that doesn't work out, there's some options that are more structured where the support is more intensive. Okay? And then it goes down from there in terms of the amount of support. Now, we did do that in Moncton. We had about 12 people of the 100 who, had a lot of difficulty finding housing that worked out for them. They had multiple evictions. So we set up what are called peer support housing. okay? And there's actually two of them now, 6-unit apartments. And one of the units is, it's actually the superintendent, it's a couple in each of the buildings who have lived experience. So they provide on-site support, but the team does provide services. So, you know, it's an adaptation. It's not what you call housing first because it's quite structured. There's rules for living there and so on and so forth. But they've had some success with helping this group of people who are running into trouble with the scattered site model in terms of them experiencing some housing stability. So I think, and I don't know to what extent, I'll be interested to hear you're looking at your systems in this kind of way. Because I think in a lot of cities, we have a lot of single-site housing programs. And there's a lot of tension right now, at least in Ottawa, between the single-site folks, what we used to call supportive housing, and the scattered site programs. There's worry that they're going to be displaced. And I think we have to figure out from a system standpoint, how can we actually accommodate, given we have these different types of housing, the people who need the housing, and what can be the role of the different types of housing. So one of them would be where single site with on-site support is for people who it doesn't work out for them in terms of housing first, okay? Certainly in Ottawa, we're not there yet in terms of that, but it is an idea. Okay. Number 4, and this surprised us, but it is consistent with the literature. Although I think what Ad Home Chez Soi brought was this very large trial. Like it's, you know, I won't say it's a definitive test of housing first, because housing first will continue to adapt and so on and so forth. But we were surprised that what I'll call the non-housing outcomes were actually quite modest. And I say modest in relation to what was happening for people receiving usual care, okay? In fact, we found only small effects in 2 areas. They're important areas. One was quality of life, so to the extent people were satisfied with their situation globally, but also specific to their living situation, safety, the leisure activities they were able to undertake. But you can see here, if you look at the actual top graph, that it goes up very quickly. And by the end, the people in treatment as usual are catching up. Okay? So there's kind of an attenuation going on. Below, the differences in community functioning, again, there's a gap. So housing first, and when I say community functioning, it's the ability in a kind of overall sense to live independently, to have the competencies to live independently in the community. And this was assessed each time people were interviewed. And again, you see the way it rises very quickly in the first 6 months, and then it plateaus. That's you know, if we unpack it a bit, the ACT programs, by the time you get to 24 months, there's not a lot of difference between treatment as usual and people with high needs. The ICM, there's a difference in terms of quality of life. We're seeing the differences here because we've put everybody together, okay? But again, modest non-housing outcomes. Now, this was the logic model that we were using. I mean, it's a very simple logic model, but it is in line with how people think about housing first, okay? Short term, you expect people to rapidly get back into housing, okay? You sort out their service needs. You build an alliance, get people engaged with the service team, with service providers. And then longer term, you get to recovery, okay? And recovery meaning integration in the community, better community functioning, people get to pursue the goals they want to pursue, and overall there's a better quality of life, okay? But that was kind of the logic that we were following, okay? Now, so the question gets raised, do we need a longer period of time before we get to the recovery? We'll see, because as I said, we are doing a 4-year follow-up in this project. Number 5, people are always interested in these programs. Once people are housed, is it helping people get into vocational training programs, schooling, work? And the answer here was it's no better than services as usual. In fact, Eric Latimer from the Douglas Hospital is doing work in this area. He's saying that, in fact, there might even be a little difference where overall, because it's such a large sample, people who are in service as usual are having more employment. But the level of employment at any one time is only about, at most, 6-7% of people in the study, okay? So it's very low, and it didn't increase over time. And some of that does include sheltered employment. About a third of the employment was sheltered, and the other was competitive. What are we doing for time here? Okay. Okay. Who's heard of $1 Million Murray? Yes. Of course. That's what's influenced this whole housing first, was Malcolm Gladwell. Essentially, what our study showed, which I think is really a departure in terms of costing, was that it's a modest investment. So people who received case management, people with moderate level of needs, it was $14,000 a year per person, all in, including rent supplements. People who received assertive community treatment, it was $22,000 a year, all in, including rent supplements. That is not the discourse that's out there in general. Now, we've relied a lot on American data, but generally we think that there's huge savings that are associated with getting people off the street and into housing. And we didn't find that. And some of it, I think, is related to $1 Million Murray. If you remember, Murray was in Reno. He racked up a lot of he was kind of a super utilizer of healthcare, social services, even the justice system. So that the idea, which is presented in the article, is if you get people in housing, you can stop all that. You can coordinate it much better. Okay, and that's partially right, because we did find if you take going in the top 10% of people in terms of their use of health care, social services, involvement in the justice system, you'll have a cost offset double the investment. $10 in gives you $20 out. Now, here's what's interesting. When the report came out, and the Mental Health Commission did a big media splash, and so on and so forth, this is the finding that got reported. But if you drill deeper, the overall $10 in gives you about $750 of cost offsets. So it doesn't quite cover the whole investment. Okay? High need, $10 in, $10 offset. Moderate need, $10 in, $350 in cost offsets. Okay? I mean, the reality is, and you know this, if you look at service use by people who are homeless, some of them are super utilizers, and some of them not at all. And then we bring people into the system, and some of them are dying, and there's all sorts of costs associated with that. So it's a very slippery slope, this kind of economic analysis. And I was never comfortable with the business case kind of argument. I really think it's a dignity. This is how people they should have a right to be off the street. You know, rather than trying to, we don't try to make business cases for things like cancer treatment or, treatment of heart disease and so on. So it's curious we would need to make it for homelessness to justify particular programs. Anyhow, those you can see where the cost offsets are. I'll move along here. Fidelity. Okay, fidelity. This is an interesting issue. We did find in at-home chez soi programs that had better fidelity to the standards, and there's a set of standards now for Housing First, had better housing outcomes, and better quality of life and better community functioning. Okay? But you have to adapt, and this is where it gets tricky. How much can you adapt? Okay? If you change things too much, fidelity goes out the window. Okay? So I think this is an area we need to pay attention to in the Housing First area. And there is now a self-assessment tool that programs can use. I don't know if you're using it in Alberta at all, but you can, people can sit down and have a group discussion and take a look at fidelity. It's a good way of reflecting on practice. There's a set of standards that you're familiar with, separating housing and services. The philosophy, the values, the services that are actually provided, the structure, and so on. Now, we did find that as much as we got modest non-housing outcomes, we did get qualitative findings that suggested that people that received Housing First, a lot of them talked about it that it transformed their life, that it literally changed things in a profound way. Okay? And so I'll just show you, this is 3 ways we coded positive life change, mixed negative life change at 18 months, and we compared the 2 groups, and you can see about 60%. The storyline at 18 months in the qualitative interviews were uniformly positive among people with Housing First. Only half of the treatment as usual, that was the case. Okay? So you get better findings with qualitative data. It appears so. In talking to Samson Barris about these findings, he thinks our measures at this point, our quantitative measures, are not precise enough to capture the differences. Landlords, I'll say just a little bit. Landlords, crucial partners, you know that. And what we found, we interviewed 23 of them in Moncton. And they were business people, and they talked about getting involved in Housing First as a business proposition, but combined with pro-social tendencies. They talked about having a family member who had lived experience. They talked about wanting to give back to their community, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you've seen that. There was a story of one of the landlords in Montreal, an Orthodox Jewish man, who told the program, bring me somebody who has gone through several apartments, and I want to see if I can help him become housed. So these kind of things, landlords are crucial partners, and you really have to nurture the relationship. If you're interested, we just published a paper on those landlord interviews. Very happy to share it with you if you let me know. The last thing I'll say in terms of key findings, housing first is a start, but it's kind of what's going to be second and third. And you know, Gino DeStasio, who's at the University of Winnipeg and who is involved in the project, his take of the modest non-housing outcomes was, yeah, but these people, they're still living in poverty. They've got housing, but they're still poor. And that limits you so greatly, you know, in terms of being integrated in the community, in terms of doing leisure activities, in terms of doing stuff and getting out, and so on. And we heard from landlords that a lot of the participants stayed in their house the whole day. So that's not integration, okay? The Ottawa program I talked to you about, when they did the fidelity assessment, the Pathways people, they were amazed that people didn't have phones because they couldn't afford it. So this becomes the really an important future kind of focus. So in closing, what do we need to focus on in terms of evolving Housing First programs? I think we need to figure out how we can better achieve recovery outcomes. I think we think that generic support can provide all sorts of things that it can't. So we probably have to be more targeted. We have to figure out how to integrate addictions treatment into Housing First. I don't think we're very successful or successful in the at-home chez soi in that area. We also have to look at ways of improving employment outcomes. I think the integration of employment support into these programs, supported employment, can make a difference, but I think it probably needs to be tested. I think we have to look at the strengths-based approach, and this is my own bias. I'm involved in a project right now that involves 8 agencies where we're bringing in this strengths-based approach in case management. It's out of Kansas, the University of Kansas. Charlie Rapp, you know, was the person. It really does get services focused on individual goals, and it's very client-centered, and I think it has a role here. You know, adapting Housing First to youth and families, I think that's going on. I mean, Stephen is certainly doing that with youth. The families, it's kind of interesting. What would that look like? And then finally, we need to figure out how to accommodate people with additional needs who are not succeeding in Housing First. Because there is that group of people, whether it's 15, 20, or 25%, and they'll fall through the cracks if we don't design our system to have alternative kind of forms of housing and support. So I've probably gone over time a bit, so I apologize, but I've got a few minutes here for questions, right? Comments?
Yes, thank you so much. I have a million questions, but I can call Tim later. Is there questions or comments around the experience of the at-home chez soi? Oh, Kevin.
I don't think I need a mic.
Well, we have the webinar, so you do. Sorry.
Apparently I do. So my question was, when you were looking at the regression analysis on the success of clients and what are the characteristics and features of those clients, did you do any examination on the correlation between program intervention and you talked later on in your slides around the fidelity or the adaptation. I know in other psychological research looking at client outcomes, it often comes down to the relationship of the client to, in those clinical cases, the therapist. I'm wondering if that was part of the analysis that might explain more of the difference than just what
we did put in alliance. We put in the two types of support as well. It just doesn't improve the prediction, eh? Although I agree with you, the alliance is certainly crucial. The difficulty, I think, at least what we saw in some of the cases where things didn't work out, where people had additional needs, is they never engaged with the service providers. There was never the development of a relationship. You know, so it was really at the low end. But yeah, I think it's a bit of a head scratcher to some extent. On the other hand, if you talk to people in the field, if you talk to people in programs, and we heard it in that home chez soi, they told us, you know, I couldn't predict who was going to be successful in our program. People came in and I thought, there's no way they'll be able to move into their own housing and take care of the business that involves in living in your own housing and being organized enough and so on. And somehow it worked out. You know, it's very fluid, it's very organic. I mean, but it's very hard to predict. And we are going to look at 2 years as well. I mean, this is at 1 year at this point. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. In line with Kevin's question for the factors that predict successful, what do you mean exactly by being successful in the program? If the guys stay for a long time in the program and has a stable housing, is it successful, or graduating from the program, is it successful, or both?
Yeah, so this was the first year. We were interested in the last 9 months, because we assumed the first 3 months is finding housing, moving into housing. To be successful, you had to have lived in the housing for 50% or more of that time, of the 9 months, or the last 3 months of the year you were consecutively housed. So that's how it was a purely a housing outcome.
Thanks again for sharing your experience and the research. Was there, and adding to the like the factors of determining if people are successful or not successful, was there anything in the qualitative interviews or in the study that was beyond what you tested in the regression models that could help develop the tool?
Maybe. I mean, we haven't looked at that. That's an interesting idea. Now, I should mention that the subsample for the qualitative is 195 people. So we might have got, I think in the end we had 195, you know, in terms of people who got interviewed at 18 months, with about half in each group. But yeah, there could be some clues, you know, looking at those trajectories. And that's the mixed methods, which I think, you know, we do want to pursue, which is, you know, quite interesting, because we could look at who's not successful and pull out their interviews at 18 months and see versus people who are where the differences lie. So it's a good idea.
Thanks, Dr. Aubry, for your great presentation. So following up on what Maricon asked, I'm curious, you had mentioned that Dr. Simbera said perhaps your quantitative measures weren't exactly measuring what you could measure a change in. So I'm just wondering, do you have a sense of what those might be, like precursors to quality life or precursors to community functioning that might affect that down the road? I'm just wondering if you guys have thought about possibilities, what your guesses might be.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, because literally, and if you go to the At Home Chez Soi website, and you know, because all of the measures are there and so on, and they're listed in the final report and so on. I mean, we covered the landscape, eh? We really did. You know, we had, you know, we mentioned the quality of life. We had functioning measures. We had health kind of measures. So, you know, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think maybe it's not so much we didn't capture the concepts. We even had a recovery measure. But I think it's more that maybe those measures are deficient. It's not the concept or the variable, you know, the outcome, but it's how it's being operationalized. You know, I think that possibly is the issue. I don't know, you know. But it does certainly highlight the importance of, you know, qualitative data. Eh? So, you know, when you're out there doing your evaluations. I'm just sort of curious. Have you done fidelity assessments? Is that because, you know, you've been involved in Housing First for a number of years now, and you have lots of really good programs. Have you done? Is that part of? Because I mean, it's interesting. It's a whole area of research, implementation science. There's kind of the view that we don't really implement programs very well, you know? And then as time goes on, there's slippage as well. So this idea of checking and seeing, you know, and reflecting on how your program is in line with a set of standards, I think is well worthwhile. And I'm particularly excited about the possibility of self-assessments, because it is something I'm going to do. You know, that we're talking about, in fact, doing a kind of a multi-program that even includes some European Housing First programs, because they do get adapted in all sorts of ways. But there's probably some core ingredients that have to be there, you know, for them to be maximally effective.
We're certainly in the process in our community of trying to begin the fidelity process, and so we've been working with the Indianapolis Center of Health Policy, who's developed a fidelity matrix, and then of course incorporating the tools that the Mental Health Commission has released, and then just finding those. I think now we're in the process of starting those conversations in the community, so
And
stay tuned for 2 years for us.
And you're familiar with the toolkit, eh? That's kind of the knowledge transfer or mobilization piece that came out of At Home, eh? Was a toolkit that you can access on the web.
And we'll certainly send that out to all conference participants. We do have a question from Jane out in the virtual world. So she wants to know if there's any recommendations on how to best integrate addictions and mental health services into Housing First services, and if they're one and the same.
Well, I think first of all, you need, I think there's probably some training that people need. I mean, I'm not sure the situation in Alberta, but we have kind of, we've moved to integrating mental health and addictions systems in Ontario, but they still are quite separate. So I think probably the importance of training. So if people are on a team, if they're case managers, getting some training around addictions treatment, I think can be helpful. I think on ACT teams, I think you need a specialist. I think that's a particular role that somebody should have on the team. The CMHA Ottawa, who I collaborate a lot with in terms of projects, and they do Housing First. They have probably the best I've seen in terms of integrating addictions treatment. They have set up group treatment program, and it's based on the stages of change, Prochaska's stages of change, and participants in their program can access, you know, the group support programs, and they're targeted specifically to you know, essentially to dealing with addictions and so on. And it's interesting, they added just recently smoking cessation. So again, that's, I think, an area we're going to see more work because, as you know, very high level of smoking in the population. And we haven't made a huge effort, and people do want to quit, to help people quit. And there's all sorts of health implications that are associated with the smoking.
Great. So I think we do have to end it here. So thank you
Good.
so much, Tim, for your
Okay.
presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you.